obs and gynae, and Dr. Sarita Shamsundar, and she's contesting for a chairperson for Foxy Gynae Oncology. I request all of you to support. They are from our Delhi people, and they are working very hard for their own fields. So it's our request for everyone, and to our Dr. Pai also.
Yeah. I'm a half Delhiite also, no?
No, we will make you full Delhiite. Don't worry.
Full Delhiite.
And
I was telling Rishma that after 2 months, I'm going to Delhi and staying for 6 months there.
I think it's all going to be a e-moving now, you know. So please look into it and support all of them.
Yeah.
Angela,
I'm happy that Delhi has got activated
want
again.
to mention Dr. Kuldeep Jain. He's standing for Vice President.
Yeah, of course.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Dr. Surveen, thank you so much.
Hardcore Delhiite.
Yes, Dr. Kuldeep Jain, and my apologies, I missed out. And yes, it's very, very important that we all work together, for our societies and for our people and for our women, you know. We all have
He's
to.
He's a candidate from Delhi, so we have to make him win.
No, we have to. We all love our Delhi people, and we all have to be together. I think, so Sunita, you can continue with that.
Yeah, well, I wanted to make a concluding remark on Rishikesh's talk.
Sure, ma'am.
I really enjoyed it, Rishi. You did an excellent job with good evidence. And I love the fact that we brought home the point that the empirical therapies only work for a very small percentage where the CGH is normal. So you know by common sense that if the CGH is abnormal and we keep giving them aspirin, heparin, GCSF, IVIG, intralipid, nothing will work. So unless we have done that exclusion, there is no point in using empirical therapy. So that is the point I wanted to make for everyone's benefits.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for an excellent talk.
Thanks.
Thank you, ma'am, for a wonderful message and conclusion. So we go on to the next part of our CME. We have Dr. Jayashree Sundar for our next talk. She'll be addressing the topic of predicting and preventing preterm labor, what evidence says. So let me invite the chairpersons for this talk. Dr. Banna Sodhi. Dr. Banna Sodhi, ma'am, she's there?
Yes, I'm here.
Dr. Banna Sodhi is Senior Consultant Obstetrics and Gynecology and an Advanced Laparoscopy Surgeon at Moolchand Hospital. She's ex-faculty FMC Pune and RNR Hospital. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you.
Dr. Lavleena Nadir. Dr. Lavleena Nadir is one of the Senior Consultants Obstetrics and Gynecology at Fortis Lafarm Hospital and with her special interest in high-risk pregnancy and laparoscopy. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you, but I think my camera is gone. I'm on.
We can see you. We can see you, ma'am. We can see you.
Okay.
I think, Lavleena, you are in the laparoscopic camera as yet.
Maybe.
Right. Maybe you've logged in through phone, ma'am. That's why.
Okay.
Yeah, so I invite Dr. Indubala Khatri, Senior Consultant Obstetrics and Gynecology at Moolchand Hospital with a special interest in laparoscopy. Welcome, Dr.
Thank you. Thank you, Sunita.
I invite Dr. Madhu Goyal, who is Senior Consultant Obstetrics and Gynecology at La Palm Hospital with her special interest in endoscopy and fertility. Welcome, Dr. Madhu. Over to chairpersons. I will request Dr. Lavleena Nadir, ma'am, to invite Dr. Jayashree Sundar for the next talk.
Thank you, Sunita. So it's my honor and privilege to invite Dr. Jayashree Sundar, and everybody knows her. She's well known, needs no introduction. She's a fellow of Royal College. She's a director at Madhukar Rainbow Hospital, and her areas of interest are low risk and high risk obstetrics, preventive gynecology, and adolescent health. She has been academically involved with RCOG courses, workshops, and perennial repair drills. And today she's going to be talking on a very important thing, that is how to predict and prevent preterm labor because it affects the neonatal outcome. Welcome, Dr. Jayashree. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lavleena. Esteemed chairpersons, Dr. Rishikesh Pai, it's a real honor to be participating in this webinar of our own Delhi Gynae Forum, which is being now led by Dr. Angela, a very dear friend and an excellent academician, with support of Sunita as well. So I would, without much ado, I will like to talk about the prevention of preterm birth. After the excellent presentation by Dr. Rishikesh Pai, I will try to do justice to the topic that has been given to me. So the remit, when we talk about preventing something, we should know what is the extent of that problem. So we as a country, we are topping the list out of the top countries who are having the maximum number of preterm births. We can see all the yellow zones are the ones which have the maximum number of preterm births. So, and it is the leading cause of perinatal morbidity and mortality. We all know that. So the incidence is about 5 to 18%, and preterm death complications are the leading cause of death among children. And 1 million deaths happened in 2015, and inequality in survival rates across the world. This is something we have to address as a population, and more than 90% of extremely preterm babies are unfortunately born in the low-income countries. So the remit of my presentation will be, how are we going to predict it, and if we are going to predict it, can we prevent it? So I will be looking at the asymptomatic pregnant woman, both the low risk category and the high risk category. Can we predict who will go into preterm labor? If yes, can we prevent it? And if a woman presents with symptoms suggestive of threatened preterm labor, can we predict who will have the preterm delivery ultimately? My presentation does not include the preterm premature rupture of membranes or twin pregnancies. So as I said, why is it so important to predict? Because we know the survival rate increases. So the increase in survival rate is 3% per day in each gestation. So every day that we keep the baby in utero, we are going to increase the survival chance by around 3%. And even 100-gram increase in birth rate is going to increase the survival rate much more. Once we touch 32 weeks, the survival rate is almost the same, but still there is a role for preventing respiratory distress syndrome even at 32 weeks. So we should be able to carry our pregnancies as far as till the 37 weeks of gestation. So whenever we talk about predicting and preventing, we should know the etiology of preterm labor. So without much ado, I will say that what are some of the causes for etiology of preterm labor includes uterine distension, ischemia, infection, overdistension, cervical disease, abnormal allograft reaction. It can be an allergic phenomena, or it could be because of endocrine disorders. So preterm labor is multifactorial, and intrauterine infection accounts for 20 to 40% of the same. And infection is the commonest cause, and of course overdistension can also be one of the major causes. So how can we predict preterm labor? So risk scoring systems have been set up, of which some of the factors that have been included are the maternal factors. So in the maternal factors, we can increasing age increases the risk of preterm labor. Women of Black and South Asian origin have more incidence of preterm labor. The women who are smoking have increased risk of preterm labor. Also, you can tell a woman to assess her uterine activity. And the most important thing, previously we used to say by clinical examination the cervical length, but now the gold standard is the transvaginal ultrasound assessment, and also screening women for infection like asymptomatic bacteriuria and genital tract infections. And there are certain biochemical markers which can also give us a prediction of the same. So once we are going to predict, we should know the history thoroughly. So when we talk about the history and risk assessment, it first is the previous, if the woman has had any previous preterm delivery, whether she has had any mid-trimester pregnancy losses, whether there is any suspicion of congenital uterine anomalies, multiple pregnancy being one factor, if there is any history of recurrent vaginal bleeding in first trimester, these women are more prone to preterm labors. Short cervix on ultrasound or on genital examination can also be a factor, and any history of cervical surgery, mainly multiple LETs of the cervix or bone biopsy, are all predictive factors for preterm labor. So we know women with previous cervical surgery does have an increased incidence of delivering before 37 weeks, more so when they have had a cold knife conization. So when we talk about uterine activity, there's no consensus available that home uterine activity reduces the rate of preterm delivery, and it is being mentioned not to be used. Digital cervical examination previously was used, but nowadays we say it should not be used routinely, and it does increase the risk of infection. So digital assessment should not be made to predict the premature labor. So let us come to the gold standard of this talk, that is the role of ultrasound. So ultrasound can be done either transabdominal transvaginally, transperineally, or transvaginally. Obviously, I've ticked on the transvaginal because that is the best method to identify the cervical length. So how is it measured? It is a highly sensitive test, and the measurement should include the total cervical length, identifying from the internal loss. And the best thing about a transvaginal ultrasound is there is very less than 10% inter-observer and intra-observer variability. So if the training has been adequate, the variability in observation is very low, and it has a high predictive value in women at risk. And predictive value is best when it is done between 14 to 22 weeks of gestation. So how is it being done? The bladder should be empty. The vaginal probe should be lubricated in a disposable sheet and gently placed the probe in the anterior fornix, and sagittal view of the cervix should be identified, and identify the internal loss, external loss, and the endocervical canal adequately. And it should be measured from the internal loss to the external loss, and apply fundal pressure for 15 seconds to observe any changes. We have had instances where if you are observing for a while, you can see the funneling happening in the cervix, and so that there should be a time lag of 15 seconds when we are approaching and looking at the cervix. And it should be done at a magnification from internal loss to external loss, as I said. So this we can see that the first picture shows complete cervical length. Let me see if the animation runs. Here we can see that there is an evidence of an amniotic fluid sludge out here, and the length of the cervix has been shortened in this picture. So this is the picture that should be seen when we are going to say, oh, the cervical length is diminished in this patient. So when we are looking at the ultrasound for predicting, the cervical length is the only and the most relevant factor. Funneling in the absence of short cervix is not a predictor for preterm labor, and the presence of amniotic fluid and debris, like we can see in this picture, is not a predictor when present singly for any call of treatment or a prediction of preterm labor, because here we can see that the cervical length is maintained adequately. So these women should not be treated unnecessarily as predicting them for preterm labor. So what this evidence tells us for high-risk women? Cervical screening should be done for all high-risk women with singleton pregnancies, and the scan should be done between 16 to 22 weeks. If short start vaginal progesterone, what is the length that is the cutoff, which is less than 25 millimeter? The woman should be talked to about cerclage, because if we see that we start on vaginal progesterone and then in 2 weeks we are going to see the patient again, then we see that there's a progressive shortening of the cervix, then cerclage should be offered to such patient in spite of progesterone if there is a shortening of the cervix. But always we should do a high vaginal swab, and also I would say urine culture and sensitivity before doing a cerclage on such patients. So that includes the high risk woman. What about the low risk woman? Is the finding of a short cervix relevant for a low risk woman? The answer, I would say, is yes, because women with history of prior spontaneous preterm birth account only for 10% of all births before 34 weeks. There is a big chunk of women who are primigravidas who land up with preterm labors, and all of us have seen this in our obstetric practice. So what is the prevalence of spontaneous birth less than 34 weeks? It's 1.8%. Iatrogenic factor constitutes 1/3 of it. Spontaneous is 2/3, of which previously affected pregnancy is just 15%. But nullipera or no previous preterm delivery can account for 85% of the birth. So that is why it is very important to screen all low risk women also, though the guidelines do not mention that, and I will be discussing it. And why should we be screening them? Because we can cause a 25% reduction in the number of preterm delivery happening just by doing a cervical cerclage or adding progesterone in their treatment. So as I said, we can see by this diagram, lesser the cervical length than 25 mm, you can see a sudden spike in the increase of the preterm labor. So it is very important that the cervix is identified correctly, because we can see the moment the cervix goes below 25 mm, the risk of having a preterm delivery can go up to 100% if the length is around 1 centimeter in 1 centimeter. So we were looking at so there were some studies which said what should be looked at when we are going to predict preterm delivery in asymptomatic patient. Should it be history? Should it be cervical length? Should we create a model for it? Or just look at an increased, all these increased risk, or just at the cervical length of less than 25 millimeter at 18 to 23 weeks. And the consensus was the single value of having a cervical length of less than 25 millimeter is good enough to predict that this woman might go into preterm labor. So we have this Fetal Maternal Foundation chart which says what are the factors we should be putting in to calculate the risk of preterm labor. And we can see it includes the maternal age, height, racial origin, whether she smokes, and her obstetric history put in detail can give us a calculated risk of what can be her risk for having a preterm birth. So when we talk about preterm death, then we have to think how are we going to prevent it. So the remit will be treatment of infection using a cerclage, tocolysis, progesterone, cervical pessary, multivitamins, and lifestyle modification. So let me go on to it one by one. So when I looked at the NICE, which is the latest guideline 2019, it says prophylactic vaginal progesterone and prophylactic cervical encerclage. Offer a choice of prophylactic vaginal progesterone or cervical encerclage to women who have both a history of spontaneous preterm birth or a mid-trimester loss and a transvaginal ultrasound of showing a cervical length of 25 millimeter or less. And we should discuss the risk and benefit of both options with the woman and make a shared decision on which treatment is the most suitable. So when using vaginal progesterone, the treatment should be started between 16 weeks and should continue at least till 34 weeks. And we should consider cervical cerclage for women when TVS shows a length of 25 millimeter or less and who have had either a preterm pre-labor rupture of membrane. So this was never an evidence before. We never used to suggest cerclage for women with a preterm pre-labor rupture of membranes. But now NICE guidelines say we should offer such women also cervical encerclage, or if she has any history of cervical trauma. So these are the amendments that were made in 2019. So if prophylactic cervical cerclage is used, there should be a plan in place for removal of the suture too. Now let us look at tocolysis. No role for prophylactic tocolysis for prevention of preterm labor. This should be a take-home message because there are many women who are kept on isoxaprine or nifedipine as a prevention for preterm labor. So the guidelines say that there is no role for using tocolysis for prevention of preterm labor, and none of these drugs should be used. But there was rofecoxib, which was tried antenatally prophylactically between 16 to 32 weeks, but though it had mild beneficial effect, there were potential adverse effects on the fetus ductus arteriosus and the kidneys. So now we come to the question that always comes into the mind of the obstetrician, because we do too much. We give too much of progesterone. When progesterone has got its own fallacies, we do see an increased incidence of obstetric cholestasis in women. So which progesterone should be used? How much should be used? And should we be combining progestrogens? Because we see a lot of prescriptions which says the woman is on natural progesterone, she's on dydrogesterone, she's also on the Proleuton injection. Should we give them so much? So what is evidence tells us? So natural progesterone should be either used in a dose of a gel, just 90 milligram, or a capsule 200 milligram, or so it should not be two combined, or it should be 17-hydroxyprogesterone caproate, which should be used in a dose of 250 milligram IM every week from the 16th week till the 34 weeks of gestation. So when we looked at the double trial, MACE in 2003 had said that hydroxyprogesterone caproate is a gold standard drug that has to be used. But suddenly we found that perinatology, there was a prolonged study which said that hydroxycaproate has got no role in it. And it is of no use. So now there was a confusion. So there was a study which we have been following always that said that hydroxycaproate is useful. But suddenly in 2020, January 2020, we were told prolonged study says, and it's a very good trial. It's a multi-center randomized double-blind trial which said it has got no role. So what do we do here? So so the next then we had the Victoria study, which said that preventing it has that also said that it has no role. So we had to come to a conclusion as to what do we do. So from being beneficial to no benefit in 2020, current understanding, which is the Society of Maternal and Fetal Medicine, which says Proluton may benefit very high risk group. However, vaginal progesterone is better in short cervix, and there is no role of adding both the medications. So this should be the take-home message, that we should not be adding or cocktailing all the progesterones together for women. So now let us look at how the vaginal progesterone stands in evidence-based medicine. The first trial was a pregnant trial, which was done again as a multicentric trial, and it definitely showed a significant reduction in the preterm birth. So I will look at the numbers needed to treat. So you just needed to give 14 micronized progesterone to prevent one preterm birth, and that is a fantastic number. So it should be used, and it's a very usable drug, and it can be used easily. So this is one medicine that we should be able to use, whether it is a low risk woman or a high risk woman. So they said that the dose needed is just 200 milligram of capsule, and it reduces the preterm birth by to 19.2%, whereas 34.4% if the drug is not being used. But then again, there was a confusion, because the Optimum study, which is again a multi-center randomized double-blind trial, which said again this progesterone has got no role. So, and they said there is no reduction in preterm birth. So then where do we stand again? What should be done for these patients? Then we looked at all the studies together at a meta-analysis, which included the Optimum study also. They did show that there was a 42% reduction in preterm births when vaginal micronized progesterone was used. So unless any further evidence is available, vaginal micronized progesterone should be offered to all women for prevention of preterm birth. And what does ACOG say? With previous preterm birth, it does say that the woman should be offered micronized progesterone. ACOG recommends more of Proluton, and it's an FDA-approved drug. They have not approved vaginal micronized progesterone as a treatment for preventing preterm labor. Their recommendation is more for Proluton or the hydroxycaproate injections. So let me look at the cost efficacy. So using these progesterones, if we can look at that, the cost is so low. That's 1,000 rupees or 2,000 rupees for treatment from the 16 weeks to the 36 weeks. And this, if it can be used, can prevent a NICU stay in a baby, where the cost might be up to 10,000 minimum at least, and it can be from 7 days to 15 days or whatever, depending upon the time the baby is being delivered. So as a recommendation, if a woman has a short cervix, whether she is high risk or low risk, progesterone should always be used in women. So next, let us come to whether progesterone is better or cervical cerclage is better. There is no randomized control trial available. An adjusted indirect comparison between vaginal progesterone and cerclage indicated that there was no significant difference for the primary and secondary outcome measure. So vaginal progesterone or cerclage are equally efficacious in the prevention of preterm birth in women with the sonographic short cervix in the mid-trimester, singleton gestation, with the previous preterm birth. So let us look at what evidence tells us about cerclage, because I am not going to discuss how a cerclage is done, because that's not the remit of the topic. So when we look at whether a woman's history and whether cerclage should be offered, so what does the RCOG tells us? It tells us that if a woman has had more than 3 preterm deliveries before 37 weeks of gestation, these are the women who should be offered a cervical cerclage based on their history. But if the history is suggestive of more than 3 preterm labors, and also they have a short cervix, definitely they should be offered history indicated cerclages. And they can also be told, if the number of preterm labors has been less than 2, they can be monitored with transvaginal ultrasound for cervical length, and it is not necessary that they should all be offered cerclage. So what does evidence say for ultrasound indicated cerclage? That if the woman has low risk, and then we find that the cervical length is 25 millimeter or less before 24 weeks of gestation, all these women should be put on progesterone, and in the absence of shortening of the cervix lesser than that, the cerclage should not be offered to these women, and maybe they should be just kept on progesterone therapy. Now, the next is the most difficult decision an obstetrician has to take when a woman comes in with the amniotic bag inside the vagina, whether we should offer them a rescue cerclage or we should not offer them a rescue cerclage. This is a decision which should be taken in consultation with the patient and the neonatologist, because sometimes it might happen that when we try to put in the suture, we might save the baby from being a 22-weeker to a 26-weeker, but the woman should also know about the implications of delivering a 26 weeks baby, because that baby is going to survive but might survive with a lot of morbidities. So this offering of a rescue cerclage should be done after thorough consultation with the neonatologist, what to expect in a baby and what will be the cost implication to the mother and the baby, and how successful it is will be for them. So it should be used very judiciously. So next I looked at comparing the Shirodkar, which is the high vaginal stitch, with the McDonald's technique, and literature says there is no difference. The Shirodkar technique is more difficult, but there is no difference in the outcome of patients whether you use a Shirodkar technique or a McDonald's technique. We all know the complications of suture placement. That is why it is very important that we identify who the suturing should be done. And in addition, I would say when we do a transabdominal encerclage, there is a risk associated with pregnancy loss and fetal growth restriction from inadvertent ligation of the uterine arteries. So it should be done very judicious. The case selection has to be very judicious as to who should have a cerclage in place. So when we talk about a transabdominal cerclage, it should be only done when there is a history of very early preterm birth, despite using a previous transvaginal cerclage. So women should not be offered transabdominal cerclage as a prime method of treatment. The prime method of treatment should always be a transvaginal cerclage, and the transabdominal cerclage should be reserved for women who have had failed transvaginal cerclage, or when there is a very insufficient cervical tissue where the transvaginal stitch can hold. So these are the only indications where the transabdominal cerclage should be offered to women. So then I looked at RCTs comparing abdominal and vaginal cerclages. When we looked at comparing transabdominal with high vaginal and low vaginal cerclages, either before conception or at less than 14 weeks of gestation, transabdominal cerclage is the treatment of choice for women with a failed vaginal cerclage, and the numbers needed to treat are sufficiently low. There will be very few women who would have failed their transvaginal cerclage, and they should be offered it, and cesarean delivery is required in this case. We have a recent trial, Maverick trial, which was conducted by Andrew Shenan and his team, which said that there is a role for doing transabdominal cerclage when there is a failed transvaginal cerclage. Then I looked at literature. What does it say? Whether we should be offering an open cerclage or a lap and cerclage. The literature says the obstetric outcome is similar. There is obviously a benefit of doing a minimal invasive procedure, but it should be according to the operator's expertise. If the operator has an expertise in doing the laparoscopic procedure, it should be offered, but obstetric outcome is the same whether it is done by open or by a lap technique. Cervical pessary, Nicolaides had a very big study about cervical pessary usage. Not much of a difference in results, but definitely there's an increased risk of vaginal discharge higher in the patient group than in the control group. The next thing that we all offer patients is antioxidants and multivitamins. There is no role of offering antioxidants or multivitamins. Lifestyle changes, when we look at these patients, we just have to say, as it applies for recurrent pregnancy loss, it should be tender, loving care and reassurance that things are going to be okay. The next question that patient asks is whether we should be on bed rest. So if we look at the chart of this randomized control trials, there is no role of giving bed rest to any patient for prevention of preterm labor. So the take-home message should be no bed rest for preventing preterm delivery. And in fact, bed rest might have its own adverse effects. And there has been a slight increase in stillbirths, perinatal death, and early neonatal death in patients who have had bed rest through the pregnancy. So that brings me to complete one part of my topic, which is preventing preterm labor. But if suppose somebody comes with pain at 28, 30 weeks of gestation, how are we going to predict whether this woman is actually going to deliver, or I can be reassured, oh, she's not going to have a preterm labor here. So what is the method of assessing her? If possible, the best method to reassure her is to do a transvaginal ultrasound for cervical length. If the length of the cervix is 30 millimeter or more, she is unlikely to go into labor at any point in time. She can be reassured and sent back home. But if the length of the cervix is less than 1.5 centimeter, then we know this woman might go into labor soon, and she should be offered treatment for the same. She should be covered with steroids. She should be given tocolysis till the time she can be shifted to other hospital or a tertiary care center where the baby will have an increased chance of survival. And there are other tests which can be done, like the fetal fibronectin test, which are bedside test. But there is no need to combine two tests. There is no need to combine transvaginal ultrasound with other tests, because it should be either or. If the transvaginal ultrasound is not available at that point in time, fetal fibronectin test can be offered to the same patient. So we can see that when you look at the cervical length, then the number of people who have delivered much early without inappropriate treatment is very few. So that is why doing the cervical length gives us a big advantage to say that, okay, I have treated this patient, I have done her tocolysis, I have carried it on, I have covered her with steroids, and this baby is going to do well. So what are the ultrasound predictors for preterm birth? When there is no fetal bleeding, it has got a positive predictive value of up to 27%. Positive fibronectin test has a positive predictive value of 54%, but all these tests have a very good negative predictive value. A negative fibronectin test has got a very strong negative predictive value that she will not go into labor, but positive predictive value is not as good. Even a short cervix on ultrasound has a very good negative predictive value. So what does NICE guideline recommend to us? That clinical assessment suggests that a woman is in suspected preterm labor and she is 30 weeks pregnant or more. Consider transvaginal ultrasound measurement of cervix as a diagnostic test and use cutoff of 15 millimeter for diagnosis of preterm labor. It also advises that TBS for cervical length is not available or not acceptable, then we should consider the fetal fibronectin testing. So what are the contraindications to testing of fetal fibronectin? If the gestation is less than 24 or more than 34 weeks, if there is a PROM, if it is a multiple pregnancy, it has got limited load, if the cervix is already 3 centimeter dilated, if there is active vaginal bleeding, or the patient has had a vaginal examination or intercourse in the previous 24 hours, it might give us a false test. So the fibronectin test should not be used. So what is the treatment available? We know bacterial vaginosis can be screened and treated, but the treatment of choice should be clindamycin, because using metronidazole may increase the adverse effect in these patients. Asymptomatic treatment of asymptomatic bacteriuria does not have any effect on preterm delivery rates. So antibiotic is not recommended after a positive fetal fibronectin test or after a diagnosis of short cervix, or treating periodontitis is not going to decrease the risk of preterm labor. Now let us look at the second part of the PROMISE trial, which Dr. Rishikesh Pai had talked about. So in this PROMISE trial, it was found that a maintenance treatment of 200 milligram of daily vaginal progesterone in women discharged home after an episode of arrested preterm labor did not significantly reduce the risk of preterm delivery. This is something we all as a habit do, that she comes in at labor at 30 weeks. When we send them home, we put them on micronized progesterone, but evidence says it has got no role in the management of these patients. And once you've arrested the labor, she will have an arrest of labor if the cervix is not dilating, and there is no need to add progesterone to these patients. So let me conclude by putting forth my take-home messages. Routine transvaginal cervical screen is effective and should be offered to all women at risk with singleton pregnancy. So we should always look at the cost effectivity of our management. So there are centers would say which don't have good ultrasound facilities or good radiographers. They'll say that offering it is a big challenge. But if where the facility is available, like we are sitting in the best part of Delhi, we should be able to predict and prevent preterm labor, and routine cervical screening should be offered to all women between 16 to 20 weeks of gestation. And strict methodology should be used for universal screening because the way of measuring should be the same. Doing a transabdominal scan and saying the cervical length is a big no. And vaginal micronized progesterone reduces the risk of early preterm birth, which is a level 1 evidence again. And I would like to say that universal cervical length screening and vaginal progesterone prevents early preterm births, reduces neonatal morbidity, and is cost saving. So doing nothing is no longer an option. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jayashree, for putting in so much of evidence together and bringing it here for all of us. Thank you so much. So there are a few questions which I will take up. There is one question on transabdominal cerclage. So the question is, if transabdominal cerclage is already decided for some patient, maybe in prior pregnancy, so would you put it before conception or at 14 weeks in next pregnancy?
So putting it in between pregnancies does have its own advantage because you're more comfortable. The patient is not pregnant. You are not worried about anesthesia. And if you look at evidence, putting it preconceptionally or after conception does not make the success any different. So if somebody is comfortable to put in the transabdominal cerclage before, it is a recommendation and it can be offered to the patient, because it's not going to change her ability. Previously, there was...
I think there is disconnection of audio.
Yeah.
Yes. We lost the connection in between Dr. Jayashree.
She's back. She's back
Yeah.
again.
We say that irrespective there is no change in the fertility level of the woman, whether we put it preconceptional, periconceptional or after conception. So it is better in the right hands maybe to do it before she conceives if she needs a transabdominal
transabdominal better to do it before, no? Because there'll be a lot of vessels and all. During pregnancy, you may go through a vessel or something. Better to do it beforehand.
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's very important, even if you're doing an internal one, so don't make it too tight. Put a Hager dilator number 8 at least, and then tie it over it. There's a lot of fashion of laparoscopy is going on. So as Dr. Pai said, and it's very important to do it before pregnancy. During pregnancy, try to have it transvaginal only. More fiddling, more chances of miscarriages and preterm rupture of the membranes.
Okay, Dr. Jayashree, there is one more question. How late in gestation have you applied a cervical stitch?
The latest that we have done on an IVF pregnancy was she came to me at 20 weeks for an MLE scan. And while scanning, we found that the length of the cervix was 2 centimeters when we were doing it. So I was a bit apprehensive but she had come in the first day on visit. So I thought she would not be comfortable if I offer her a new test. So we did a high vaginal swab urine culture. I called her back after 2 days. And luckily, I had told her that please don't eat anything and come, let us review you again. And believe it or not, the length of the cervix that was left was hardly a centimeter. So that really put us back. Within 2 days there was a big change, and I put it in at around 21, 22 weeks. I have tried a rescue cerclage at 24 weeks, but the patient carried on for 10 to 15 days. The rescue cerclage part is very hard. How much ever people say I'm very confident of putting it, it's very difficult to take a cerclage through these patients. And many times I think whether, I don't know what the house will say, but doing it at 24 weeks means if the baby is going to be delivered at 26 weeks, na idhar ka na udhar ka, because the baby is going to have its morbidity. So we should be preparing the patient mentally as to what they are going to have in their hand, whether it's going to work or not, whether we are going to be in a stage wherein we cannot give up on the baby or we cannot go back on delivering her. So the rescue cerclage is something I would be more worried about. The latest I put is 22 weeks, I think.
Rescue cerclage, very difficult. Yeah. Whenever you diagnose patients are already 3 to 4 centimeter, not the dilatation, even they're so thin. If you put it, they just cut through, you know.
Yeah, I had a patient who was primey. She just told me in my bathroom I was sitting. Primey, no risk factors. She said something is coming out the moment I'm sitting in the pod. I called her thinking that she is just making it up because she's a very big fashion designer. So I thought every time she will have a concern. The moment I put in the speculum, I could see the amniotic bag standing out. I couldn't believe it myself. At 18 weeks, why did she land? We had a lot of discussion and she was very fussy about resting, and I didn't want her to go till 40 weeks with that vaginal bag, and ultimately we opted out of that because she went into labor and we gave up on the pregnancy. I hope she conceives soon.
I would request chairpersons also, Dr. Banaswati ma'am, please comment on this. How late in gestation you have applied the cervical cerclage? Dr. Banna?
Yeah, hi. I have given an encirclage at about 22-24 weeks with a patient who's come with a little dilatation, and we give a worm suture. This was when I was in the armed forces. And it's a very difficult suture. The dilatation has taken place. Some membranes are already bulging. So this worm suture, which is given, which is box type of a suture, which is given. And we have given it, we carried her on till about 32 weeks. And after that, she went into labor and couldn't be stopped. So this is the latest that one has given, and that too in an emergency situation. So it is a very difficult challenge. It's very difficult.
In our old PGI days, we used to give a lot of worm suture, you know?
Yeah.
Can I make a comment, Angela?
There is another, yeah, ma'am, you are saying something, Dr. Mala, ma'am?
Yeah, I think the rescue cerclage, in my opinion, only has a place if you can go from a non-viable to a viable state. As Jayashree was saying, if it's 22 weeks, we're not going to reach 28 weeks. I think if, in my opinion, I would do it when she comes to you at around 24 weeks, 26 weeks, or 25 weeks. You want to gain 10 days and steroid time and give the best chance. And most of them are IVF pregnancies, and they don't want to give up on their baby at around the viability stage. So that is the only phase.
Absolutely.
And I think that laparoscopic is done interval. But with this interval cerclage, sometimes these patients then find it so difficult to get pregnant. And I've had a patient who got an interval cerclage done. And after that, we tried IUIs, we tried everything, just wouldn't get pregnant. So that is another dilemma if you do an interval cerclage. But the morbidity, mortality is much less than if you're doing it in pregnancy.
I wanted to ask you, someone was saying recently that there's this steroid which you give for lung maturity. Is it causing some problem in the psychology? Yes. I think you were only saying.
Yeah, I was only saying. So there is a paper that behavioral abnormalities are higher in the group that receives antenatal steroids. And that includes autism, behavioral disorders, attention deficit disorders. And I think it is because we are all across the board giving antenatal steroids at the slightest indication. I think that will have to be revised now.
So I also have a point here that we have so many IVF specialists out here. I think there's a lot of anxiety to give take-home babies to the mothers. So I have seen many clinics who start giving them steroids from 26 weeks, 27 weeks. So are we going to keep on repeating steroids? So should we not be using better screening methods to say, okay, she's not going to deliver now, or I'm going to give the best benefit of steroid when she's going into labor, even if there is an absent end diastolic flow. I mean, even if there is a high resistance, so she will not have absent end diastolic flow immediately at 27 weeks. She will take a week more to have absent. She will take a week more to become reverse flow. Then we will look at the ductus, and then we are going to deliver those babies. Why give them steroid at 26 weeks, 27 weeks? I think there should be a strong message, as Dr. Mala said, that we should not be using steroids recurrently on these. It has no role, and steroids should be given only when we know, yes, I am going to deliver this baby, because the take-home baby is not important. The quality of life is also important to parents, and I think we should be fair to our patients. And we don't as a unit, especially I have a very good fetal medicine department, so we don't use steroids unless I know, okay, this week I'm going to deliver this baby, whether it is PIH or it is twin pregnancy, and we use it only when I know, okay, this patient is going to deliver now. And most of the time they cross 34 weeks, many of them don't need it at all.
I think that's such an important,
wonderful.
Dr. Mala and Jayashree has put it. You know, even with the IVF pregnancy, twin pregnancy, as soon from 26 weeks onwards, every 2 weeks people are giving steroids. I think, Sunita, we should note it down. The next topic we should take it, and role of antenatal steroids. I think we all need to look into it, and as a Delhi Gynae Forum, you know, we should look into it, that we should go to. I think the next, you know, you do one forum, one talk, and then this leads to the next one. What we are all interested in, you know.
Yeah, thanks. There are two, three more questions, so let me take them quickly. How is fibronectin test done, and can it be done bedside?
Yeah, it is a bedside test. We do have these actin Partus kits available in our country also now. So you have two lines. It's like a urine test, and it's all very self-indicative when you do that test. So we have both the actin Partus test and the actin partum and the actin Partus test, and they are really very good in diagnosing. And many a times when we have PPROM, you don't do an exam. You just put it in there, and you know that, oh, this woman has leaked, and you carry her forward accordingly. Similarly, preterm labor can be also diagnosed with the actin Partus test. It's a wonderful test to be done on bedside. But if you have already got a sonologist scanning her and saying that the cervical length is shortened, unnecessarily doing two tests together. Previously, they used to say that do the test together, but now the recommendation is it should be either or. And
how much it costs? How much it
costs? I think it is 1,200 rupees. I think we have kept it in our OPDs, and we do use it for patients.
Where do you get the kit from?
It can be done only after 24 weeks of gestation. Is that
so?
It
should be used only after 24 weeks of gestation.
So is it?
Share the number and the.
I will, Doctor.
The group.
I will. Yeah.
Yeah, that will be great. Another question is, Dr. Jayashree, what is the role of duodenone and nifedipine in preterm labor?
So, duodenone is a drug to be mentioned, to be condemned. It's not recommended in any of the evidence-based practices that we do. Nifedipine definitely has a role. So with the usage of nifedipine should be very cautious. So if, as I said, if somebody is at 30 weeks, actively contracting, actin patterns positive, or the cervical length is less than 1.5 centimeter, then we know this woman is going to go into labor. I have not covered her with steroids. So to give me the benefit of time to cover her with steroids or get my neonatal team ready, I would definitely give her nifedipine for 48 hours at the most. So we can either use nifedipine or atosiban, the oxytocin receptor antagonist, but atosiban is very expensive. So when I was in the UK at that time, we used to do the fetal fibronectin test. If that is positive, then atosiban was used because it's a lot of expenditure for the patient. But we have seen efficacy-wise, both nifedipine and atosiban have the same role. Duodenone has got no role, though there are a lot of old school of thought. Evidence does not support the use of duodenone at all, and nifedipine should not be used for eternity. But I'll tell you, we had one of the patients who had multiple pregnancy. We should use with caution nifedipine because these are the ones who might have a low ejection fraction, and they are the